So thank you first for having invited the Nuclear Energy Agency to this conference, and we hope to make a contribution. I'm going to share in this presentation some of the work we're doing, which I think fits in this presentation, this conference. I'll say a few words about the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, who we are and who we work for, and then try to talk through the topic sustainability of the nuclear fuel cycle. Looking first at technology and fuel cycle per se, but then extending the topic to so say a broader perspective. So the Nuclear Energy Agency is an agency of the OECD, a twin sister of the International Energy Agency, and we have 31 member states. The latest one being Russia, who joined 1st of January this year. Not all the countries, not all the member countries of the NEA have nuclear power, but overall they represent 88% of the world installed capacity. Our work includes nuclear safety and regulation, nuclear energy development, radioactive waste management, radiological protection, public health, nuclear law and liability, and nuclear science and data bank. And we also serve as technical secretariat for the Generation 4 International Forum. So sustainability of the nuclear fuel cycle, I try to represent some of the concepts that are behind that in this sort of well-known energy triangle. At the core, of course, there's technology, the fuel, the type of products that nuclear energy can deliver. Safety and non-proliferation are essential part of the sustainability of the nuclear fuel cycle. Public acceptance as well. It's an essential part. And then try to develop low carbon aspects, affordability, and the contribution to nuclear to the security of energy supply. So in terms of technology, what I would like to talk a little bit about is some of the work we have done on the nuclear fuel cycle and scenarios, and report on a study that was published recently, last year, called Trends Towards the Sustainability of the Nuclear Fuel Cycle. Then I will talk a little bit about the contribution of nuclear energy to the decarbonization of the energy system, and on this subject we work a lot with the International Energy Agency, and I'll say a few words on the latest publication. The topic of economics that was touched on by David Shropshire, of course, is an essential part of the sustainability of the nuclear energy systems, and I will mention a few recent reports, including one on the system effects of nuclear and renewables. And throughout our work, we're interested in the contribution that nuclear energy makes to the security of energy supply, and that's what our member states want to know. And when they consider nuclear energy in their energy system, it's really from that perspective, as well as economics and low carbon aspects. So this study that was published in 2011 is an update of a 2001 study called Trends in the Nuclear Fuel Cycle, looked at what was done, say, basically from 2001 to 2011, and what is coming in the next decades, with a focus on criteria for sustainability, which is protection of environment, the optimal use of resources, waste management, proliferation resistance, safety, and economics. So I'll just walk through the recommendations and conclusions from this work. First of all, concerning, let's say, uranium resources, just as was said in the last presentation, there is enough production capacity to meet demand for the next for the century, provided the plans for expanding, say, mining capacities are achieved, and there are issues behind that as well, like legal regulatory processes that need to be in place or smoothed. There have been fuel design improvements over the last decade to deal with severe accidents, high burn-up, power-up rates, flexibility, and also recently there's quite a lot of work on accident-tolerant fuel following the Fukushima accident. Having said that, there hasn't been much, increase in recycling of spent fuel, reprocessed uranium or MOX fuel, over the last decade. The countries that have been using that have continued using partial recycling, but not many more countries have started looking at that. But we also realized that we need an integrated approach to the whole economics of the fuel cycle, and we have a study that I will just mention towards the end of the talk that will provide this analysis and information. So the recommendations to the government was to ensure efficient approval processes for the mining development, ensuring that the best practices in mining are applied, and also to ensure the long-term security of supply of uranium given the long-term operation of nuclear power plants. Concerning the back end, reprocessing, as I mentioned, in some countries, there are drivers for the use of reprocessing, including transition to fast reactors, but we also recognize that some countries prefer the once-through option and are quite happy with that. In terms of waste management, however, the study really concluded that implementation of geological disposal of high-level waste needs to remain a priority. We're happy that some countries like Finland and Sweden and France also are really going ahead with this. In terms of advanced reactors and fuel cycle and the presentation of Richard Stainsby after mine, we'll probably talk a lot more about that. There are really step changes in the sustainability of nuclear energy that can be achieved through the use of advanced fuel cycles. But again, we also recognize that governments need to support, let's say, the transition to such systems, and international cooperation, at least at R&D levels, should be further promoted. So that concludes my little contribution on the fuel cycle per se, but I want to also jump to the contribution of nuclear energy to the decarbonization of the energy systems. And I will use some of the slides that the International Energy Agency or the OECD Environment Directorate have produced over the last years, showing that it is essential to decarbonize the power system. Today, that represents 40% of the emissions of the whole energy sector, and that could, on a business as usual scenario, represent 75% of the total emissions by 2050. And the role that nuclear energy has in reducing carbon emissions from the power sector has been recognized by a lot of international agencies, the IEA, but also the IAEA, the World Energy Council, the World Nuclear Association, and national studies as well. Just to remind you, a publication from the International Energy Agency in 2012 called Energy Technology Perspectives, which is their scenarios to 2050. The model that the IEA uses, the least cost optimization of the energy system with some constraints like policies, for example, national policies. And they offer projections, which are not predictions, just to be clear on that. And there are 2-degree scenarios from 2012, basically, which is post-Fukushima, says that basically the installed capacity has to grow from 375 gigawatts to 1,100 gigawatt by 2050 if we're to achieve a decarbonized energy system. So that's a huge growth in capacity and new build. And we at the NEA published a study called Role of Nuclear Energy in a Low-Carbon Energy Future, which looks at what are the requirements in terms of new build, in terms of long-term operation, and what are the challenges facing the sector, including the supply chain issues. But overall, we can say that the role of nuclear power as a reliable low-carbon energy source is established. Having said that, are we on track to that 2-degree scenario? And the answer is clearly no. And recently, the IEA published a kind of status report called Tracking Clean Energy Progress 2013, which looks at all the technologies. You have that color scheme on the top right of the screen. You see nuclear power is in red. It's not where it should be. And if you look at the green box, you see, for instance, the bars represent the connections to the grid. We should be on average connecting 16 gigawatts of nuclear a year in this decade, where today we have about 3 or 4 gigawatts. So we're not on track. And those 16 gigawatts a year that we should be connecting through this decade is not something that's completely out of reach. In the 70s and 80s, we were connecting 30 gigawatts a year actually in a much smaller number of countries that were developing nuclear energy. Recommendations from that report, from the IEA reports, and going back to maybe the presentation on the UK earlier on, is that more favorable electricity market mechanisms and investment conditions must be put in place, treating all low-carbon sources on an equal footing. So we're here talking about having the same kind of support for renewables as for nuclear, or for nuclear as for renewables. Of course, public acceptance being a major issue, fast implementation of all the post-Fukushima safety upgrades need to be made. And there is also a recognition that there needs to be continued support for advanced fission reactors to ensure a new generation of reactors, that the technologies for these could be ready for deployment before the middle of the century. Since we talked about climate change and that we're not on track to that 2-degree scenarios, and we're maybe on a 4-degree or even worse scenario, we can anticipate extreme weather events related to climate change. And I think it's fair to say that all energy infrastructures are vulnerable to those extreme weather events. We have talked about this with our member states, and we've launched a study called Climate Change, Assessment of the Vulnerability of Nuclear Power Plants and the Cost of Adaptation. And what we're looking at, and we hope to publish this study by the end of next year, we're looking at the impact of climate change on the operation of nuclear power plants and the cost of adapting, of making them more resilient. We're looking at case studies of extreme weather events, heat waves, floods, droughts, frazzle, ice storms, looking at a special focus on water and energy. You know that nuclear power requires a lot of water for cooling, and so what are the issues at stake? And also, very importantly, regulations, both from the safety point of view and from the environmental point of view. So now a few words on economics. How am I doing for time? Okay, that's good. So we published a number of reports over the last years. Most of them concerned with the new build, economics of new build, but also one on long-term operation for existing reactors. And just to give some numbers for these long-term operation costs, it was estimated between $500 and $1,000 US dollars per kilowatt hour, and that includes the post-Fukushima safety upgrades, which are in the range 100 to 200 US dollars per kilowatt hour. So that's for the long-term operation, and we recognize that we need, especially given the fact that new build is slow to come, that we need proper management of the existing reactors. Now, concerning new build, there was a study in 2010 on projected costs of nuclear energy, and this needs to be updated, especially because of the cost overruns of these first-of-a-kind projects, Flamanville, Kilrote, that were mentioned. There was a study on carbon pricing, which, of course, concludes that it helps improve the competitiveness of nuclear power, but we also recognize that industry has to build on time and budget to reduce those first-of-a-kind costs, otherwise carbon pricing can't help. And then the study that I would like to talk about is nuclear energy and renewables. I have another slide, but just to summarize that the high penetration level of renewables leads to a decrease in the load factor and the profitability of the dispatchable technologies like gas or nuclear, and also the recognition that system costs, grid, but also backup balancing must be accounted for and allocated. So for this study, which was published last year, end of last year, lessons learned: integration of large percentage of variable renewables is a challenge for the electricity systems and the dispatchable generators. So we based on case studies provided by the member states, found grid-level system costs for variable renewables, which depend on technology and depend on countries, range between $15 and $18 a megawatt hour. For nuclear, these are much smaller, in the range 1 to 3. Also, the grid level and the system costs increase a lot more as the percentage of renewable increases in the share of the whole electricity system. And of course, the recognition that lower load factors and lower prices affect the economics of dispatchable generators. And we have seen in the last couple of months a lot of, in Europe, a lot of gas-fired power stations closing down. And in the long term, the issue will be, we have today enough backup capacity, but who's going to invest in the long term to provide these backup capacities if the economics are not there? So the policy recommendations from this study was that system costs must be accounted for, and there has to be transparency on all the power generation costs, and there needs to be new, say, regulatory frameworks to internalize those system effects. And there are different ways of doing that: capacity payment, obliging operators to feed stable hourly bands of capacity into the grid, etc. And also the study recognized that nuclear remains the main dispatchable low-carbon technology and has benefits in the long-term stability of the electricity system and the security of energy supply. I mentioned earlier on in the presentation this study on economics of the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. It's under final review, so I can't give you the conclusions yet. We will publish it hopefully during the summer. But what we looked at was the economics of managing radioactive waste in OECD countries, looking at spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste, comparison of costs of the different options, direct disposal, partial recycling with the light water reactors and MOX fuel, or multi-recycling with the light water reactors and fast reactors. And we applied a common methodology to compare the costs of the various options. So this hopefully will provide some guidance for policymakers in terms of nuclear fuel cycle strategies. So long-term prospects for nuclear energy, probably there will be improved sustainability of the nuclear fuel cycle through the development of advanced nuclear systems like Generation 4 reactors, but also perhaps small modular reactors that are developed and promoted as being safer and maybe more economical, but that this needs to be proven. We need to have small modular reactors built and built in numbers to really conclude on that. And what I wanted to also say that there are also non-electric applications of nuclear energy that can be considered. Energy is not just about electricity generation, but about heat and fuel for transport. And nuclear energy can be used to provide non-electric products. But there are issues, and replace fossil fuel applications in the process, and so contribute even more to the decarbonization of the energy systems. But there are many challenges for that. Hydrogen production using high-temperature reactors. Well, there are a lot of issues, technical and economic issues to develop that, and including markets as well. So I won't say anything about Generation 4 reactors, because I think Richard Stainsby in his presentation will just say, but just looking at the goals of the Generation 4 reactors, it really is about improving the sustainability of the nuclear energy system. So in conclusion, and going back to the energy triangle, what the message that we would like to pass on to you is that sustainability of a nuclear energy system is not just about the reactor and its fuel cycle. I think we really need to take a broader view and think of nuclear energy as part of a low carbon electricity system, and there are integration challenges of nuclear energy systems in low carbon grids with renewables, for instance. There might be technology developments that need to be made, and there are issues of resilience of the whole system, for example, under climate change threats. And perhaps in the long term, though it's certainly not a sort of short-term issue, think beyond electricity markets by looking at, say, substitution of fossil fuel processes by nuclear systems. Thank you.